The air in the sanitation chamber was cold, sterile, tasting of ozone and the faint chemical bitterness of the final suppressant mist. Asset 734 stood motionless on the central dais, arms held slightly away from his body, palms open to the ceiling emitters. He did not feel the cold. Sensation was a variable, and variables were liabilities. His body was a tool, calibrated for a single purpose, and the chamber was the final stage of that calibration. The mist descended, a hissing shroud of microscopic agents that bonded to his skin, his hair, the very fibers of his tactical suit. It was a second skin of nothingness, designed to erase him from the olfactory spectrum. He was a ghost before he even left the facility. He was not a person. He was a weapon. His breath was a measured, silent thing, a function of autonomic systems he had learned to command. In. A count of 4. Hold. A count of 7. Out. A count of 8. The rhythm was a metronome in the hollow space of his mind, a replacement for the frantic, animal beat of a heart he was trained to ignore. The heart was the seat of emotion, the source of compromise. His was merely a pump, circulating oxygenated blood to the muscles that would execute his directive. The directive was simple: infiltrate the Phoenix sector, locate the target, designation Daedalus, terminate. The name was a designation, a string of data points. It meant nothing. The man attached to it was an obstacle to the consortium's mandate of stability and order, a rogue alpha, a charismatic ideologue stirring dissent among the outer colonies, a cancer. Asset 734 was the scalpel. The final emitter cycled off with a soft pneumatic hiss. A green light illuminated the recessed panel by the exit slit. The calibration was complete. He moved from the dais, his steps perfectly silent on the polished chrome steel floor. His suit was a marvel of consortium engineering, a weave of photoreactive polymers and sound-dampening fibers. It made him a ripple in the visual field, a whisper in the auditory. Combined with the olfactory cloak, he was less than a shadow. He was an absence. He passed through the exit slit into the launch bay, a cavernous space humming with the low-frequency thrum of a suborbital transport's engines. The air here was different, tinged with the scent of ionized particles and recycled oxygen. He catalogued it, dismissed it. A handler stood waiting by the transport's ramp, a beta in a severe grey uniform, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She held out a datapad. Asset 734, she said, her voice as flat and colorless as her surroundings. Final briefing. The target's compound is shielded against conventional scans, but we have a topographical schematic from a compromised drone. Your entry point is a ventilation shaft on the northern face. It is a 3-kilometer infiltration on foot from the drop zone. The terrain is volatile. Expect environmental resistance. He took the datapad, his gloved fingers swiping through the data. Maps, thermal readings, structural weaknesses. The face of the target appeared on the screen. Reese, that was the given name. A strong jaw, dark eyes that seemed to hold a disquieting intelligence even in the still image, and hair the color of midnight. An alpha. The file noted his scent profile was unusually potent, with complex pheromonal markers. It was flagged as a potential psychological weapon. Asset 734 felt nothing. He had been inoculated against such things, his own biology chemically straitjacketed since infancy. An Omega's sensitivity was a flaw, a bug in the code. The consortium had patched it. He was not an Omega. He was an asset. The target is known to keep a small, loyalist guard, the handler continued. her gaze fixed on a point just past his shoulder. They are ideologically committed. Expect fanaticism. Your rules of engagement are unrestricted. Eliminate any and all obstructions. Understood, he replied. The word was a vibration in his chest, devoid of inflection. It was an acknowledgement of data received. Upon successful termination, you will exfiltrate to the secondary rally point. A retrieval team will meet you at 0400 standard time. Do not deviate. Do not compromise the mission. She paused, her eyes finally meeting his. They were grey, like the uniform, like the walls, like the sky outside the viewport. The consortium expects a clean resolution. Daedalus has become a symbol. Erase him. He handed the datapad back. He had already committed every byte of information to memory. The schematic was a three-dimensional blueprint in his mind. The face was a target matrix. The scent profile was a disregarded variable. He turned and walked up the ramp into the transport's belly. The interior was dark, functional, smelling of cold metal and hydraulic fluid. He strapped himself into the single crash couch, the restraints locking into place with a series of sharp clicks. The ramp sealed behind him, plunging the hold into absolute darkness. He did not need light. He had the mission. He closed his eyes, slowing his breath, letting the rhythmic count of 478 pull him into a state of metabolic conservation. The engines whined, the deck plates vibrated, and the transport lurched into the sky. He was moving. He was a vector, a line of intention drawn across the map, pointing directly at the heart of a man named Reese. He thought of the file, the potent scent, the warning. It was irrelevant data. A scent could not stop a blade. Pheromones could not deflect a bullet. He was a precision instrument, and his target was simply the material upon which he would perform his function. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was the inevitable, clean resolution. And he was coming. The journey was a passage through silence and darkness, a perfect reflection of the space he occupied within himself. He felt the subtle shift as the transport broke atmosphere, the brief, violent shudder of re-entry, and then the smooth glide toward the drop zone. He was a package, waiting to be delivered. The only thing that mattered was the moment the door would open and his function would begin. The drop was a silent fall through the cold night air. The transport disengaged him at an altitude of 2,000 meters, and he descended with only the whisper of his suit cutting through the wind. He landed with the grace of a falling leaf, his body absorbing the impact without a sound. He was in a forest, an actual living forest. The consortium had paved over most natural biomes, replacing them with hydroponic towers and atmospheric processors. The air here was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp, resinous tang of pine. His olfactory cloak repelled it, kept him in his bubble of sterile nothingness, but the sheer density of the sensory information was a low hum against his shields. He ignored it. It was noise. He oriented himself using the suit's internal compass and began the 3-kilometer trek. The forest was dark, the canopy of the ancient trees swallowing what little light the twin moons provided. His optical filters shifted, turning the world into a landscape of silver and grey. Every branch, every root, every nocturnal creature rendered in perfect, ghostly clarity. He moved through it like a wraith, his feet making no purchase on the damp soil, his form blending into the shifting shadows. He was a part of the darkness, a more perfect predator than any of the creatures that froze and watched him pass. The compound was built into the side of a mountain, a fusion of natural rock and reinforced plasteel. It was designed to be a fortress, but every fortress had a flaw. The drone schematic had been precise. The ventilation shaft was exactly where the data had indicated, a dark rectangle of a grate hidden behind a curtain of thick, clinging ivy. He scaled the rock face with practiced ease, his gloves adhering to the stone with magnetic surety. He pried the grate loose, the sound a dull, metallic groan that was swallowed by the sigh of the wind. The shaft was narrow, cold, and smelled of ozone and recycled air, a scent far more familiar than the riot of organic life outside. He slipped inside, replacing the grate behind him. Now, he was inside the machine, his home territory. The schematic unfolded in his mind's eye. He moved through the labyrinthine ducts, a ghost in the machine's own veins. He passed over living quarters, mess halls, and command centers, the muffled sounds of life below, nothing more than ambient noise. He was above them, beyond them, untouchable. The target's private quarters were located in the deepest, most secure section of the compound, carved from the mountain's heart. He navigated the branching paths, his movements economical and precise. There was no hesitation. There was only the path and the destination. Finally, he reached the designated ventilation access point. It was a small grate directly above the target's study. He peered through the slats. The room below was quiet, lit by the soft glow of a single lamp on a large wooden desk. Books lined the walls, real books made of paper and ink, a decadent anachronism in a world of datapads. The air was still. The target was there. He sat in a high-backed chair, his back to the vent, looking at a large star chart projected onto the far wall. Asset 734 drew his weapon, a monomolecular blade whose edge vibrated at a frequency that could sever molecular bonds. It made no sound as it slid from its sheath. He tested the grate. It was unsecured. A simple lift and drop. He would be on the target in less than a second. The termination would be silent, instantaneous, a clean resolution. He regulated his breathing. 4, 7, 8. He prepared to move. And then the man in the chair, Reese, spoke into the silence. "You can come down now," he said, his voice calm, measured, without a trace of alarm. "The air must be rather stale up there." Asset 734 froze. He had not been detected. It was impossible. His suit, his cloak, his silence, they were perfect. It was a trick, a bluff. He remained still, a predator waiting for the prey's mistake. The man sighed softly and turned his chair. He looked up, his dark eyes seeming to pierce the shadows of the vent, to see past the grate, to find him. "I know you are there. I have been expecting you." He did not look afraid. He looked weary. And then he did something that defied all tactical logic. He stood up, walked to the center of the room, directly below the vent, and simply waited. He was offering himself. It was a trap. It had to be. Asset 734's training screamed at him, cycling through a dozen scenarios of ambush and deception. But his orders were clear. Terminate the target. The opportunity was perfect. He lifted the grate. The metal was cool against his gloved fingers. He dropped. He landed in a silent crouch, the blade held in a reverse grip, ready to strike. The distance between them was 2 meters. He could close it in a fraction of a second. But something was wrong. The air in the room was wrong. It was thick, layered, and it pushed against his olfactory cloak with an insistent pressure he had never experienced. It wasn't just a scent. It was a presence. It was the smell of old paper and wood smoke, of ozone from the star chart projector, and something else, something deep and primal and overwhelming. Reese stood perfectly still, his hands open at his sides. He was wearing simple, dark clothing, nothing that could conceal a weapon or armor. He was completely vulnerable. "The consortium sent their best, I see," Reese said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very air. "A ghost. They do so love their elegant solutions." As he spoke, the scent intensified. It was like a wave, a physical force that slammed into Asset 734's defenses. His cloak flickered. For a terrifying instant, he felt a breach, a crack in the sterile wall of his conditioning. The scent poured through. It was warm, like sun-baked earth and ancient forests. It was sharp, like crisp mountain air and crackling embers. It was rich, like dark spices and old leather. It was alpha, not the sanitized, controlled scent of a consortium alpha, but something wild, untamed, and absolute. It bypassed his mind, his training, his very will, and spoke directly to the suppressed, shackled biology deep within him. His body betrayed him. A tremor started in his hands, rattling the monomolecular blade. His breath hitched, the perfect rhythm of 4-7-8 shattering into a ragged gasp. The scent was everywhere, inside him, wrapping around his spine, sinking into his bones. It was a command. It was a declaration of power that his own muted nature had no defense against. It wasn't just dominance. It was safety. It was sanctuary. It was home. A concept so alien it was like a foreign word he suddenly understood. His knees buckled. The strength fled his limbs, replaced by a profound, terrifying weakness. The blade clattered to the floor, the sound obscenely loud in the sudden silence of his collapsing world. He fell, not forward in an attack, but down. He landed on his knees on the hard floor, the impact a dull thud that echoed the implosion of his identity. His head bowed, his gloved hands braced against the ground as a wave of vertigo and nausea washed over him. The world tilted on its axis, the mission, the handler, the consortium. It all faded into a distant roar, drowned out by the overwhelming reality of the scent and the man who wore it. He was an asset. He was a weapon. He was on his knees before his target, disarmed not by force, but by a fragrance. He was not a ghost. He was not a machine. He was an Omega. And for the first time in his life, he knew what it meant to be in the presence of a true alpha. The shame was a fire in his throat. The terror was a block of ice in his gut. He had failed. He had not just failed the mission. He had failed to be what they made him. He was broken. The world swam back into focus slowly, a fractured mosaic of sensory input he could not process. The hard grain of the floorboards pressed against his palms. The low hum of the projector was a needle in his ear. And the scent was a blanket, heavy and suffocating, and yet, impossibly, a source of profound calm. It settled the frantic, panicked screaming in his mind, smoothing it into a low, thrumming terror. He remained on his knees, head bowed, unable to look up, unable to move. Every cell in his body was screaming two contradictory commands: flee and submit. His training warred with an instinct he didn't know he possessed, a civil war that left him paralyzed in its wake. He heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching him. The scent grew stronger, more concentrated, and a fresh wave of weakness rolled through him. He braced himself for the end, for the blade in his back, the pressure on his neck. It was what he deserved. A failed asset was a liability, and liabilities were erased. But the killing blow never came. Instead, the footsteps stopped in front of him. He saw a pair of simple leather boots enter his limited field of vision. A long moment of silence stretched, thick with tension and the suffocating weight of his failure. Then, Rhys spoke again, his voice softer now, laced with something that sounded unnervingly like pity. "The suppressants they use," he said, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "They are brutally effective. They don't just mask the scent, they attempt to cauterize the parts of you that can perceive it. But they can't erase it completely. Not something this fundamental." He knelt, not in a threatening way, but slowly, deliberately, bringing his face level with Asset 734's bowed head. The proximity was devastating. The alpha scent was no longer a wave, but an ocean, and he was drowning in it. "Look at me," Rhys said. It was not a command born of dominance, but a quiet request. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. His neck muscles protested, locked in a posture of submission he hadn't chosen. Slowly, shakily, he lifted his head. He met the target's eyes. They were as dark as the file had shown, but they weren't cold. They were filled with a deep, analytical curiosity and a profound, unsettling sadness. "What is your designation?" Rhys asked. The question was a physical blow. Designation, that was what he was. A number, a tool. "Asset 734, he managed to force out, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Rhys's expression didn't change, but something flickered in the depths of his eyes. "They gave you a number." "Of course they did." "Do you have a name?" A name. He searched the empty corridors of his memory. There were flashes, fragments of a life before the facility, before the training, a color, a sound, a feeling of warmth, but no name. The consortium had scrubbed it away, a useless piece of legacy code. "No," he whispered. "I see," Rhys said, and the sadness in his eyes deepened. "They take everything, don't they?" He reached out a hand slowly, giving him ample time to react. Asset 734 flinched, a violent, involuntary jerk, but he was too weak to pull away. Rhys's fingers, warm and calloused, brushed against his helmeted cheek. Through the suit's fabric, he could feel the contact as a spike of alien warmth. "They built you into a weapon," Rhys murmured, his gaze intense. "They pointed you at me, but they made one critical miscalculation." He paused. "They assumed I was like them." With that, he rose to his feet, turning his back on the kneeling, broken assassin. He walked over to his desk and deactivated the star chart. The room plunged into a deeper darkness, lit only by the single desk lamp. "Get up," Rhys said, his back still to him. "Your mission is over." The words made no sense. His mission was not over until the target was terminated, or he was. There was no other outcome. Yet he found himself obeying. His limbs, heavy and unresponsive, pushed him upright. He swayed on his feet, his balance precarious. He looked at the blade on the floor, then at the man by the desk. He could still complete the mission. He could lunge, retrieve the weapon, and finish it. But the thought was a distant echo, a ghost of a command from a life that no longer felt like his own. His body would not obey. His will was not his own. It belonged to the scent in the air, to the quiet authority of the man who was supposed to be his victim. What are you going to do to me?" The question was a surrender, an admission that he was no longer in control of his own fate. Rhys turned around, leaning back against the desk. He crossed his arms, studying the asset with that same unnerving calm. "For now, nothing. You are experiencing a full-system biological shock. The consortium's suppressants create a state of extreme sensory deprivation. Your olfactory cloak has failed, and your internal systems are being flooded with stimuli they have been conditioned to reject. In a few hours, you will begin withdrawal. It will not be pleasant. He spoke with the detached precision of a doctor discussing a diagnosis. You are a danger to yourself right now, not to me. He gestured to a door on the far side of the room. There is a room through there. It has a bed and a sonic purifier. You will stay there. It was an order, but it was delivered as a statement of fact. Asset 734 stared at him, his mind struggling to piece together the shattered fragments of his reality. A prisoner? Was he a prisoner? Why? He asked, the single word a testament to his confusion. Why are you not killing me? Reese offered a small, sad smile. It did not reach his eyes. Because you are not my enemy, he said. You are a symptom of the disease I am trying to cure. Killing you would be like swatting a fly while the plague rages on. It's a pointless, cruel gesture. He pushed off the desk. Now go. Rest, before the fever starts. He turned away again, dismissing him, a clear sign that the conversation was over. The implicit trust was more disorienting than any threat. He was leaving a trained killer, armed and in his private quarters, and simply turning his back. It was a power play of a different kind, one that Asset 734 had no training to counter. Numbly, he walked towards the indicated door. His every step felt heavy, as if he were wading through water. He was a ghost out of his machine, a program running on corrupted code. He opened the door and stepped inside, closing it softly behind him. The room was sparse, a bed, a small table, no windows, a cell. But it didn't feel like a cell. It felt like a sanctuary from the overwhelming presence in the other room. He peeled off his helmet, dropping it to the floor. The recycled air of the suit was replaced by the clean, filtered air of the room, still faintly tinged with the alpha's scent. He looked at his reflection in the dark, polished surface of the door. He saw a pale, gaunt face, eyes wide with a terror he had never been allowed to feel, and sweat beading on his brow. He did not recognize the person staring back at him. Asset 734 was gone. He had died in the other room, on his knees, and in his place was this stranger, this terrified, broken thing. And as the first tremor of withdrawal shook his body, he knew that Reese was right. The fever was starting. The hours that followed were a descent into a hell he hadn't known existed. His body, so long held in a state of artificial stasis, began to rebel. The first stage was a violent tremor that seized his muscles, a deep, cellular shivering that had nothing to do with the cold. His teeth chattered, and his limbs jerked in spasms he could not control. He stripped off the tactical suit, the familiar weight of it suddenly unbearable, a cage he had to escape. Beneath it, he wore only a thin, grey underlayer, which was soon soaked with a cold, clammy sweat. He curled up on the small bed, wrapping his arms around himself, trying to hold his fragmenting body together. His perfect control, the bedrock of his existence, was gone. He was a passenger in a vessel consumed by mutiny. Then came the sensory overload. Without the suppressants and the suit's filters, the world rushed in with excruciating clarity. The simple hum of the purifier became a deafening roar. The soft fabric of the blanket against his skin was coarse, abrasive, like sandpaper. The faint light leaking from under the door was a blinding glare. And the scents, every stray molecule of dust, the metallic tang of the ventilation system, the clean, sterile smell of the purifier. They were all sharp, distinct, and agonizingly intense. Over it all, a constant, lingering ghost of Reese's scent remained, a deep bass note beneath the cacophony, a torment that was also, terrifyingly, the only thing that anchored him. Memories, fragmented and brutal, began to surface. Not memories of a life, but of the process that had unmade him. The cold touch of medical droids, the sharp sting of injections, hundreds of them, thousands, each one a nail driving his true nature deeper into its coffin. The disembodied voice of a trainer repeating the litanies of his conditioning. An Omega's instinct is a liability. Emotion is a flaw. Attachment is a vector for compromise. You are not a person. You are an asset. He saw the faces of other children, pale and wide-eyed like him, in the sterile white rooms of the facility. He remembered the ones who had failed the conditioning, the ones whose biology had refused to break. They had simply disappeared. He was one of the successful ones, a triumph of consortium science. He had been hollowed out and rebuilt into something perfect, something useful. And now that perfection was shattering, and the hollow space inside him was filling with a pain so vast it threatened to tear him apart. He was not just withdrawing from a drug. He was withdrawing from the obliteration of his own self. At some point, the door opened. He barely registered it, lost in a fever dream of past and present. Reese entered, carrying a tray. He moved with that same infuriating calm, seemingly unaffected by the maelstrom of the asset's suffering. He set the tray on the small table. It held a glass of water and a small, white pill. "The tremors are peaking," Reese said, his voice cutting through the noise in Kyle's head. He no longer called him asset. He wasn't sure what to call him. "This will help with the worst of the symptoms. It's a neural dampener. It won't stop the process, but it will make it more bearable." Kyle. The name felt strange. A borrowed piece of clothing that didn't fit shook his head violently, curling tighter into himself. "No," he rasped, his throat raw. "No more chemicals. No more control." The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He was rejecting help from the man he was sent to kill, clinging to the purity of his agony as the last thing that was truly his. Reese watched him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "As you wish," he said simply. He did not press the issue. He took the pill from the tray, but left the glass of water. "You are severely dehydrated. Drink." He then pulled the room's single chair over to the bedside and sat down. He just sat there, in the dim light, watching. His presence was an agony and a balm. The proximity of his scent should have been overwhelming, another layer of sensory torture. But it wasn't. It cut through the chaos, a clear, steady signal in a storm of static. It seemed to soothe the frantic trembling of his cells, to quiet the screaming in his nerves. It didn't lessen the pain, but it gave it a shape, a focus. It was an anchor in the storm. Kyle didn't understand. This man was his target, his enemy. He should be repulsed by him, fighting him, even in this weakened state. Instead, some deep, broken part of him craved his presence, leaned into it like a dying plant, leaning toward the sun. "Why are you here?" Kale gritted out, his eyes squeezed shut against the light, against the sight of the man who had undone him. "To observe," Reese answered, his voice even. "The consortium's methods are thorough. I have seen the results of their sanitization protocols before, but never on one of their elite assets. I need to understand the process of reversal. I need to know what they did to you." The clinical detachment in his voice should have been insulting. He was being studied, a specimen in a lab. But beneath the scientific curiosity, Kyle heard something else, a thread of anger, an anger directed not at him, but at the consortium, at what they had done. Hours bled into one another. The fever peaked, burning through him, leaving him exhausted and empty. The tremors subsided into a constant, low-grade ache. The sensory overload lessened, the world sharpening into a painful but manageable clarity. Through it all, Rhys remained. He did not speak much. He simply sat, a silent, steady sentinel. He would periodically offer the water, and Kale, his body screaming with thirst, would eventually relent, his shaking hands barely able to hold the glass. Each time Rhys's fingers brushed his, a jolt, like an electric current, would pass through him, a shocking, intimate contact that was more terrifying than any weapon. He was being kept alive by his target. He was being cared for by the man he was meant to murder. The absurdity of it was a form of madness in itself. As the worst of the physical withdrawal passed, it left a void, and into that void flooded the emotions he had been trained to suppress. Fear, stark and cold, shame, hot and corrosive, confusion, a disorienting fog, and beneath it all, a deep, aching loneliness he had never known he was capable of feeling. He was utterly, completely alone, a failed weapon, disconnected from his purpose, his creators, a ghost stranded between worlds. One time, in a moment of lucidity between waves of pain, he looked at Rhys and asked, "Who are you?" Rhys looked back, his dark eyes holding Kale's gaze. "My name is Rhys. I am the leader of the Aegean Compact, a coalition of outer colonies that believe individuals have the right to their own biology, their own emotions, and their own destinies." He spoke the words simply, as if stating facts from a textbook. "The consortium calls me Daedalus. They see me as a terrorist, a genetic purist who threatens to unravel the stability they have so carefully constructed, a stability built on the suppression of the human spirit." "You are a rebel," Kyle stated, the word tasting foreign. "I am a liberator," Rhys corrected gently. "I don't seek to overthrow the consortium. I seek to offer an alternative, a place where people are not forced to be, less than what they are. A place where an omega is not a flaw to be corrected, and an alpha is not just a tool for command." He looked pointedly at Kale. "A place where you would not have to be Asset 734. The words hung in the air between them. They were a condemnation of everything Kale had ever been, and a promise of something he couldn't begin to imagine. He had been sent to kill a symbol of rebellion. He was beginning to realize he had been sent to kill the only man who had ever truly seen him. Not as an asset, not as a weapon, but as a person trapped inside a cage. And that knowledge was more devastating than any physical pain. The fever had broken, but the true sickness, the one that had infected his soul, was only just beginning to make itself known. In the days that followed, Kale's world slowly expanded beyond the four walls of the recovery room. Rhys, deeming him no longer a danger to himself, allowed him to move into the main quarters. It was a strange, suspended existence. He was not a guest, not a prisoner, not an ally. He was an anomaly, an artifact of a world that had no place here. The compound, which he had first experienced as a tactical schematic, revealed itself to be a living, breathing community. It was a warren of tunnels and chambers carved from the mountain's rock, but it was filled with light from cunningly placed solar conduits and the warmth of human life. People moved through the corridors with purpose. their faces etched with the hardships of rebellion, but also with a resolve he had never seen in the blank, neutral expressions of consortium citizens. They were betas, alphas, and even a few other omegas. They lived and worked together, their dynamics a natural, unsuppressed part of their interactions. To Kale, it was like watching aliens. He saw omegas working as engineers and tacticians, their heightened senses and empathetic abilities treated as assets, not pathologies. He saw alphas in the hydroponic gardens, their protective instincts channeled into nurturing life, not just commanding troops. He saw a society built not on the denial of biology, but on its integration. It was chaotic, inefficient, and utterly terrifyingly beautiful. The people of the compound treated him with a mixture of suspicion and pity. He was the consortium ghost, the assassin who had come in the night. They gave him a wide berth. He understood. He was a monster from a story they told their children. The only person who treated him as something other than a threat was Reese. Reese gave him tasks, simple, menial things, cleaning hydroponic filters, sorting geological survey data, calibrating atmospheric sensors. The work was grounding, a set of procedures and protocols he could understand. It kept his mind from spiraling into the vast, empty space of his new reality. During these tasks, Reese would often be nearby, working on his own projects. He would speak to Kale not with the intention of interrogation, but with the quiet curiosity of a scientist. He asked about the training, about the chemical regimens, about the psychological conditioning. Kale answered in the flat, detached monotone he had been taught, relaying information as if describing a machine he had once operated. But Reese would push gently. How did it feel? He would ask, and Kyle would have no answer. Feel was not a data point. It was a corrupting influence. I was not required to feel, he would reply. I was required to perform. Reese would just nod, a flicker of that familiar sadness in his eyes. A perfect tool, he would murmur, more to himself than to Kale. And what does a tool do when it is no longer required to perform? One day, a beta named Lena approached him in the mess hall. She was Reese's second-in-command, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a face that seemed permanently etched with skeptical concern. She placed a tray of food in front of him. He hadn't realized he had been staring at a wall for over an hour. You should eat, she said. Her tone was not kind, but it was not hostile. It was practical. Reese believes you can be salvaged. I am less optimistic. I am a failed asset, Kale said, the words a familiar, comforting mantra of self-loathing. There is nothing to salvage. That is the consortium speaking, Lena countered, taking a seat opposite him. You are parroting your programming. The question is there anyone else inside that head of yours? She leaned forward, her gaze piercing. I have seen what the consortium does. They don't just train soldiers. They hollow them out. They scoop out everything that makes a person and leave behind an obedient shell. Reese thinks he can help you find what they took. I think he is a fool who trusts too easily. Prove one of us right. She stood up and walked away, leaving him with the tray of food and her unsettling words. Is there anyone else inside? He didn't know. He felt like a house that had been emptied of all its furniture. The structure was there, but the life was gone. The only thing that made him feel real was Reese's presence. The alpha's scent was a constant, low hum in his new, hypersensitive world. It no longer brought him to his knees, but it was a perpetual reminder of his own nature, a nature he was slowly, terrifyingly beginning to experience. He started to dream. He had never dreamed before, or if he had, the conditioning had wiped them clean. Now they were vivid, chaotic nightmares. He dreamt of the white rooms of the facility, of needles and restraints. He dreamt of falling through an endless dark sky. But sometimes he dreamt of other things, a field of tall grass under a yellow sun, the sound of laughter, a hand, smaller than his, holding his own. He would wake up with his heart pounding, a ghost of an emotion, longing or grief, clinging to him like smoke. He told Reese about the dreams. They were in Reese's study, the same room where Kale's life had ended and begun again. Reese was analyzing a string of genetic code on his datapad. He listened without looking up from his work. "Those aren't just dreams," he said after a long silence. "They are memory fragments. The conditioning buries them, but it can't always destroy them. They are pieces of the person you were before they took you." "They are meaningless," Kale said, his voice tight. "They are distractions." "Are they?" Reese finally looked up, his dark eyes seeming to see right through Kale's defenses. "Or are they the only meaningful thing you have left?" He stood and walked to a small, locked cabinet in the corner of the room. He keyed in a code, and it opened with a soft hiss. He removed a small metal box. "The consortium keeps meticulous records," Reese said, placing the box on the desk between them. "They are arrogant. They believe their data is so secure, their history so thoroughly rewritten, that the truth can do no harm." They were wrong. He opened the box. Inside was a single, old-fashioned paper file. He pushed it across the desk toward Kale. On the tab, a single word was written. A name. Alien. Kyle stared at it. The word felt both alien and intimately familiar. It resonated with something deep inside him, a chord that had not been struck in years. "What is this?" he whispered. "It's you," Reese said softly. "It is the file from the intake facility. Before you were Asset 734. Before they tried to erase you. Your name is Elian." Kyle, Elian, reached out a trembling hand and opened the file. Inside was a picture of a small, dark-haired boy with wide, frightened eyes. And beneath it, data, birthplace, parental designations, and a medical profile. Classification Omega, subject displays unusually high empathetic sensitivity and pheromonal acuity, recommended for the asset program, prime candidate for sanitization and weaponization. He stared at the face of the boy, and for the first time since he could remember, he felt a tear trace a cold path down his cheek. He was not a tool. He was not a number. He had been a child, and they had stolen him. They had stolen Elian. The revelation of his name was not a key that unlocked his past, but a crack in the dam of his conditioning. In the weeks that followed, the cracks spread. The memory fragments became more frequent, more coherent. He remembered the smell of rain on hot pavement, the taste of a sweet fruit he couldn't name, the feeling of being held in strong, safe arms. He remembered a woman's voice singing a lullaby. These memories were like shards of glass, beautiful and sharp, and they hurt to hold. He was Elian. The name felt strange on his tongue, a word in a language he was just relearning. He started using it, tentatively at first, in the privacy of his own mind. "I am Elian." The statement was an act of rebellion. Reese never pushed him. He simply created the space for this fragile new identity to grow. He continued their discussions, but they shifted. He no longer asked about the conditioning. He asked about the dreams. He would listen as Elian haltingly described the flashes of his former life, And sometimes Rees would fill in the context, drawing from his vast knowledge of the pre-consortium worlds. "That fruit you described," he might say, "it only grows on the coastal regions of Cygnus X1. It's called a sun pear." It was a small thing, but it was everything. It told Elian that his past was real, that the world he faintly remembered had existed. It was not just a corruption in his data. Elian started to observe Rees more closely, trying to understand the man who had simultaneously destroyed and saved him. Rees was a paradox. He was a brilliant scientist, his mind a razor-sharp instrument capable of deciphering complex genetic codes and designing sophisticated cloaking technology for his compound. But he was also a leader who inspired a fierce, quiet loyalty in his people. He governed not through command, but through consensus and reason. He would spend hours debating hydroponic crop rotations with a beta botanist, and then turn around and plot a daring raid on a consortium supply convoy with Lena. His defining characteristic was a profound, almost weary empathy. He carried the weight of his people's hopes and fears on his shoulders, and Elian could see the toll it took in the quiet moments when Rees thought no one was watching. The alpha scent that had once overwhelmed him became a familiar part of his environment. He learned to read its subtle shifts, a sharper, more resonant note when Rees was concentrating, a warmer, earthy tone when he was speaking with his people, and a faint, almost undetectable trace of something like burnt ozone when he was worried or under stress. This new sensory language was a revelation. He had been taught that scent was a weapon or a weakness. Rees showed him it was a form of communication, more honest than any words. One evening, Elian found Rees in a part of the compound he had never seen before, a small, hidden laboratory. It was filled with complex machinery that hummed with a quiet energy. At the center of the room was a large, cylindrical stasis pod. "What is this place?" Elian asked, his voice hushed. Rees turned from a console, his face illuminated by the green glow of the screen. "This is the heart of my work," he said. "This is why the consortium wants me dead." He gestured to the console. "The consortium's sanitization protocol is a masterpiece of genetic engineering. They don't just suppress your biology with chemicals, they introduce a retrovirus that latches onto your DNA. It rewrites the very code that makes you an omega, or an alpha. It severs the connection between your biology and your consciousness. They call it dynamic neutralization. I call it soul murder." Elian felt a chill run down his spine. It was one thing to know he had been conditioned, another to learn he had been fundamentally, genetically altered. "The suppressants you were on," Rees continued, "they weren't just blocking your scent. They were reinforcing the virus, keeping it active. When you were exposed to my specific pheromonal signature, it created a counter-frequency. It acted as a catalyst, temporarily disabling the virus. That's why your system crashed so violently. Your body, your true biology, tried to reassert itself all at once." He pointed to the stasis pod. "For years, I have been working on a cure, a way to permanently purge the virus and restore what was taken, a genetic amnesty, as I call it." "You can fix what they did?" Elian whispered, the hope in his own voice so raw and fragile it terrified him. "I believe so," Rees said, his expression grim. "But the process is dangerous, unstable. It requires a catalyst, a specific pheromonal key to unlock the damaged DNA sequences before the cure can be administered. I have synthesized catalysts for several beta and alpha variants of the virus. but the Omega strain. It is more complex, more deeply woven into the host's genome. I have not been able to synthesize a key for it." He paused, and his gaze met Elian's. The unspoken truth hung in the air between them, heavy and absolute. "Not until now," Rhys finished softly. "My natural scent. It appears to be the key for your strain of the virus. You are the proof of concept, Elian. You are the first Omega to have your sanitization reversed, even if it was by accident." Elian stared at him, his mind reeling. He was not just a failed asset. He was the key. His catastrophic failure was Rhys's greatest breakthrough. The mission, his entire life's purpose, had been a lie designed to prevent the very thing that was now happening. He wasn't sent to kill a man. He was sent to destroy the cure for his own condition. He looked from Rhys's tired, hopeful face to the humming stasis pod. He saw his reflection in the curved glass, the face of a stranger, the face of a ghost, the face of Elian. He finally understood the stakes. This was not just about him. It was about all the others, all the numbered assets, all the hollowed-out children in the white rooms. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, and for the first time his voice was steady, clear, and entirely his own. The discovery transformed Elian's purpose. He was no longer a ghost haunting the corridors of the compound. He was an active participant in its most vital mission. He spent nearly all his time with Rhys in the hidden laboratory, a silent and focused apprentice. He learned to operate the complex diagnostic equipment, to read the intricate maps of the human genome, and to understand the delicate, dangerous dance of viral therapy. His consortium training, with its emphasis on precision, data analysis, and unwavering focus, proved to be an unexpected asset. He could sit for hours, monitoring microscopic changes in cell cultures, his patience seemingly infinite. He was a tool, but now he was a tool for healing, not for killing. He was reclaiming his own programming. The work was a strange kind of intimacy. They would often be the only two people in the lab, working late into the night cycle, the only sounds the soft hum of the machines and their own quiet breathing. In these moments, the professional distance between them would sometimes fray. Elian would catch Rhys watching him, a look of complex emotion on his face, pride, concern, and something deeper, something more personal that Elian did not dare to name. Elian, in turn, found himself increasingly attuned to the alpha. He could sense Rhys's frustration when an experiment failed, a subtle sharpening of his scent that was imperceptible to anyone else. He could feel Rhys's brief moments of triumph as a low, warm thrum in the air. He was learning to read the man, not as a target, but as a person. And the more he learned, the more a dangerous and unfamiliar feeling began to take root in the hollowed-out spaces of his heart. It was a feeling of loyalty, of protectiveness, a feeling that went beyond gratitude or a shared purpose. One night, as they were analyzing the results of a successful simulation, Rhys suddenly swayed, his hand going to his temple. He leaned heavily against a console, his face pale. "Rhys?" Elian was at his side in an instant, his hand hovering over Rhys's arm, unsure of the protocol for such a situation. "I'm fine," Rhys said, his voice strained. "Just exhausted." But Elian could smell it. The scent of ozone and metal, the sharp tang of stress, was stronger than he had ever perceived it before. And beneath it, something else, the scent of pain. "You are not fine," Elian stated, his voice flat with certainty. He placed a hand on Rhys's arm. The contact was firm, steady. You are pushing yourself too hard. You haven't slept in 3 cycles. Rhys looked at him, and for the first time, Elian saw not the unshakable leader or the brilliant scientist, but a man stretched to his breaking point. The work is too important, Rhys murmured. The consortium is not idle. They know their asset failed. They know I'm still alive. They will send another, stronger, faster, more complete. We are running out of time. And you will be no use to anyone if you collapse, Elian countered, his voice hardening with an authority that surprised them both. You need to rest. He guided the unresisting Alpha to a small cot in the corner of the lab. Rhys sank onto it, his body surrendering to the exhaustion he had been fighting for days. Elian retrieved a blanket and draped it over him. As he did, his fingers brushed against Rhys's neck. The skin was hot, feverish. Rhys's eyes fluttered shut. Stay, he whispered, the word barely audible. Just for a moment. Elian froze. The request was a breach of every boundary, every protocol that still governed his shattered world. But he could not deny it. He sat on the floor by the cot, his back against the cool metal of the stasis pod. He didn't speak. He just sat, a silent guardian, as Rhys finally succumbed to a deep, healing sleep. As he watched the steady rise and fall of Rhys's chest, Elian acknowledged the truth he had been avoiding. His feelings for Rhys were not just loyalty. It was attachment, a vector for compromise, a flaw in his design. But it did not feel like a flaw. It felt like the only part of him that had never been touched by the consortium, a small, stubborn seed of warmth that had survived the long winter of his conditioning. And he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he would do anything to protect it. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Elian, and he would not let them take anything else from him. With Elian's help, the research accelerated. His unique biology, the very thing that had caused his mission to fail, was now their greatest advantage. He was the living key, and by studying the interaction between his recovering systems and Rhys's pheromones, they began to map the precise pathway to reversing the sanitization process. The cure, once a distant theoretical possibility, was becoming a tangible reality. As they worked, Elian began to change in ways that had nothing to do with science. The hollow places inside him were beginning to fill. He started speaking with other members of the community, his conversations stilted and awkward at first, but slowly becoming more natural. He learned the names of the botanists in the hydroponic gardens. He listened to the stories of the refugees who had fled the consortium's iron grip. He was becoming part of the fabric of the place, no longer a ghost, but a presence. His senses, once a source of agony, were becoming a gift. He could smell a coming dust storm on the wind hours before the sensors picked it up. He could hear the subtle shift in the mountain's rock that signaled a need for structural reinforcement. He could sense the emotional state of a room, the subtle currents of fear, hope, and determination that flowed through the community. Lena, the skeptical beta, watched his transformation with a grudging respect. "You're not him anymore," she said to him one day, her arms crossed as she observed him calibrating a sensor array with meticulous care. "The ghost. He's gone." "He is not gone," Elian replied, without looking up from his work. "He is a part of me, a reminder of what I will not become again." The bond between him and Rhys deepened, settling into a quiet rhythm of shared purpose and unspoken understanding. The lab was their sanctuary, a world of two where the unspoken was often more powerful than the said, A shared look across a humming console, a brief touch of hands while passing a datapad, a moment of synchronized breathing in the silence of a completed calculation. These became the language of their connection. It was a fragile, tentative thing, a green shoot pushing its way through the concrete of their pasts. One cycle, after a particularly grueling series of tests, they sat in the quiet of the lab, the data confirming a major breakthrough. The cure was stable. It was ready. A wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed through the room. "We did it," Reese said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Elian, his eyes shining in the dim light. "No," he corrected himself. "You did it, Elian. Your courage to face what they did to you. That was the final catalyst." Before Elian could process the words, Reese closed the distance between them. He raised a hand and gently cupped Elian's cheek, his thumb stroking the skin just below his eye. The touch was not clinical or paternal. It was something else entirely. It was reverence. "I never thought," Reese began, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I never thought I would find someone who could understand." Elian's breath caught in his throat. His heart, the pump he had been trained to ignore, was hammering against his ribs. The Alpha's scent, now so familiar, deepened, becoming richer, warmer, laced with an emotion that was raw and vulnerable. It was a question, an offering, and Elian's own body answered without his permission. A subtle, sweet scent, like night-blooming jasmine and clean rain, bloomed from his skin. It was the first time his own true scent had ever manifested, a scent of an Omega, pure and unsuppressed, a scent of acceptance. Reese inhaled sharply, his eyes widening in surprise and then darkening with an intensity that made Elian's knees feel weak all over again. But this time, it was not from submission or fear. It was from a powerful, resonant desire. "Elian," Reese breathed, the name a prayer. He leaned in, and the world narrowed to the space between their lips. But just as they were about to touch, a klaxon blared through the compound, a harsh, screaming alarm that shattered the moment into 1,000 pieces. Red lights flashed, painting the lab in strobes of crimson. Over the intercom, Lena's voice was tight with urgency. "Breach! We have a breach in the northern sector. Unidentified hostile. All hands to defensive positions. Reese, they're here." The moment was gone. The tenderness was replaced by the cold, hard reality of their war. Reese pulled back, his face instantly transforming from the vulnerable man to the resolute leader. The warmth in his eyes was replaced by glacial calm. "It's the consortium," he said, his voice grim. "They sent another one." He looked at Elian, and in his eyes was a new fear. A fear not for himself, but for the man standing before him. The man he had almost kissed. "Stay here," Reese commanded. "Lock down the lab. Protect the cure. That is your priority." He turned to leave, but Elian grabbed his arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "No," Elian said, his voice low and fierce. "My training was for one purpose, to be a weapon. Let me be one. For you. For us." Reese stared at him, at the defiant fire in his eyes, at the man who was no longer an asset, no longer a victim, but a warrior choosing his own battle. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Stay with me," he said, "and stay alive." They left the lab together, running into the red-lit chaos of the besieged compound, the promise of what might have been hanging between them, fragile and uncertain, like a single perfect note cut short by the roar of an explosion. The corridors of the compound were a controlled chaos. People ran to their posts, their faces grim but resolved. The sharp smell of ozone from discharged energy weapons filled the air, a scent that made Elian's combat instincts flare to life. He moved at Reese's side, his body falling back into the familiar, deadly grace of his training. But this time, it was different. He was not an absence, a ghost. He was present, his senses alive, cataloguing every detail not as abstract data, but as a threat to the people he now considered his own. Reese moved with the calm authority of a true commander, issuing orders into his comm unit, directing his people with a strategist's precision. He was the mind of the rebellion. But Elian knew, with a cold certainty, that the consortium's weapon would not be targeting the soldiers. It would be coming for the mind. "They will come for you," Elian said, his voice low as they reached the central command chamber. "Their target will be the leader, the symbol." "I know," Reese replied, his eyes scanning the tactical display that showed a single, hostile signature moving rapidly through the northern sector, bypassing defenses as if they weren't there. "It's moving too fast. It's not a team. It's one operative, like you." Like me, Elian thought, but better, newer, without the flaw. Lena met them at the command console, her face pale but her hand steady. "It's cutting through our best defenses, Reese. It moves like a shadow. We can't get a lock on it." "It's a Phase 2 asset," Elian said, his blood running cold. He had only heard rumors of them in the facility. Enhanced reflexes, synaptic acceleration, and a next-generation olfactory cloak. My model was obsolete the day it was deployed. He looked at Reese. "You cannot fight it. It's designed to be the perfect alpha killer. It won't be susceptible to your scent. Its conditioning will be absolute." "Then we don't fight it head-on," Reese said, his gaze fixed on the display. "We change the battlefield." He turned to Lena. "Seal the blast doors to this sector. Reroute all power from non-essential systems to the primary magnetic containment field around the lab. Create a bottleneck in Corridor 7. He then turned to Elian, his expression grave. "It will hunt me by my scent. That is its primary tracking method. But you are an Omega. Your scent is a different frequency, one its programming might not be prepared for. And more than that, you can sense it in a way we cannot." It was a desperate gamble, a plan formed in seconds, but Elian understood it instantly. They would use Reese as bait and Elian as the trap. They would use the very biology the consortium sought to erase as their ultimate weapon. "I understand," Elian said. There was no fear, only a cold, clear purpose. He looked at Reese, a silent communication passing between them. This was for more than just survival. It was for the future they had almost tasted in the quiet of the lab. They moved to Corridor 7, a long, narrow passageway carved from the rock. Reese stood at one end, a deliberate, fragrant beacon in the darkness. Elian concealed himself in an alcove halfway down the hall, melting into the shadows. He closed his eyes, shutting down his sight to heighten his other senses. He reached out with his mind, with his scent, with the heightened acuity that was his birthright. He filtered out the background noise, the distant clang of blast doors, the smell of fear from the compound's defenders, the steady, reassuring scent of Reese. He searched for the void, the nothingness, the signature of a consortium ghost. And then he found it. A perfect, cold emptiness moving through the chaos. It was like a hole in the world, a pocket of absolute sterility. It was coming. Elian slowed his breathing, falling into the old rhythm. 4, 7, 8. But it was not to calm himself. It was to control himself, to become a predator. the shadow, appeared at the far end of the corridor. It was a humanoid shape, but it seemed to drink the light around it. It wore a suit sleeker and darker than Elian's had been. It paused for a moment, its helmeted head tilting as it pinpointed Reese's scent. Then it moved. It was not running. It was a blur, an exercise in impossible speed, closing the distance with silent, lethal grace. Elian waited. He let it pass his position. He timed his attack to the precise microsecond the asset would be focused entirely on its target, on the final, fatal strike. As the Phase 2 asset raised its weapon, a blade identical to the one Elian had once carried, Elian exploded from the shadows. He did not attack the asset itself. He attacked its world. He opened the floodgates of his own biology. He released his scent. Not the subtle, questioning fragrance from the lab, but a full, powerful wave of it. A concentrated burst of pure omega pheromones, a desperate, defiant scream of life in the face of sterile death. It was the scent of jasmine and rain, but amplified, sharpened into a weapon. It was a signal so fundamental, so primal, that no amount of conditioning could entirely ignore it. For a creature trained in a world of sensory nothingness, it was the equivalent of a flashbang grenade detonating inside its mind. The Phase 2 asset faltered. For a single, critical heartbeat, its perfect form hesitated. Its head jerked toward Elian, its programming momentarily scrambled by the unexpected, overwhelming sensory input. It was a biological error, a flaw, and it was all the opening Elian needed. He didn't have the asset's speed or strength, but he had its knowledge. He knew how it was trained, how it would react. He knew its pressure points, the weak seams in its armor, the blind spots in its combat algorithms. He moved inside its guard, his hand striking not the asset, but the emitter unit on its belt, the source of its olfactory cloak. There was a shower of sparks, a high-pitched whine, and the cloak failed. The corridor was suddenly flooded with the asset's own scent. It was faint, chemically suppressed, but it was there, the sterile, controlled scent of a sanitized Omega. Just like him. Elian stared into the dark visor of the helmet, and he saw his own reflection. He saw the ghost he used to be. "I know what you are," Elian said, his voice a low growl. The asset responded, its voice a synthesized, toneless rasp from its helmet speaker. "You are a contaminated element, a failed mission. You will be purged." It recovered with terrifying speed, its blade slashing in an arc that would have bisected Elian. But Elian was already moving, flowing backward, his body remembering years of brutal training. He was outmatched, but he was not beaten, because he was not just fighting with his body. He was fighting with his senses. He could feel the subtle shifts in the air as the asset moved. He could smell the faint tang of ozone from its suit's power cells. He was no longer fighting in the dark. He had a map the asset couldn't read. Reese chose that moment to act. He triggered the magnetic field. A deep hum filled the air, and the metallic walls of the corridor pulsed with energy. The Phase 2 asset, its suit containing advanced cybernetics, seized up, its movements suddenly sluggish and clumsy as the powerful magnetic forces interfered with its systems. It was the opening, the final opening. Elian lunged forward, not with a weapon, but with his bare hands. He grabbed the asset's helmet, his fingers finding the emergency release latches he knew had to be there. He twisted. With a hiss of depressurizing air, the helmet came off. The face beneath was young, impossibly young. A boy, no older than Elian had been when he was taken. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of confusion and programmed rage. His face was pale, gaunt, a mirror image of the face Elian had first seen in the reflection on his cell door. And in that moment, Elian saw the truth. This was not a monster. This was another victim. This was another Elian. He did not deliver a killing blow. He struck the pressure point on the boy's neck, a precise, non-lethal strike that sent the young asset crumpling to the floor, unconscious. The battle was over. Silence descended on the corridor, broken only by the hum of the magnetic field and the ragged sound of Elian's own breathing. He stood over the fallen boy, his body trembling with adrenaline and a profound, aching sorrow. Rhys approached him slowly, his face a mask of relief and awe. He looked from Elian to the unconscious asset on the floor. "You did not kill him," Rhys said, his voice quiet. Elian looked up, his eyes meeting Rhys's. "He is not the enemy," he said, his voice hoarse. "He is the disease, and we have the cure." In his eyes, Rhys saw the last ghost of Asset 734 finally fade away, replaced completely by the fierce, compassionate, and unbroken spirit of Elian. In the aftermath, a quiet, exhausted sense of victory settled over the compound. The immediate threat was neutralized, the breach was sealed, and the people, though shaken, were alive. The unconscious Phase 2 asset was taken to the medical bay, stripped of his suit and weaponry, and placed under careful observation. He was a prisoner, but as Elian looked at the boy's peaceful, sleeping face, he knew he was also their first patient. The battle had changed everything. Elian was no longer the assassin in the shadows, the object of suspicion and pity. He was a defender. He had stood between the community and the cold death the consortium had sent for them, and he had won. Not with a blade, but with the very essence of himself he had been taught to despise. He walked through the corridors, and people met his gaze. They nodded, they smiled. He was one of them now, his place earned in the fire of combat. He found Rhys in his study, the place where it had all begun. The Alpha was standing before the large star chart, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at his own reflection in the dark screen. He looked up as Elian entered. The weight of command had settled back on his shoulders, but beneath it, there was a new lightness, a hope that hadn't been there before. "Lena is securing the perimeter," Rhys said, his voice tired but steady. "The asset is stable. The initial scans show his conditioning is formidable. But the viral strain is the same as yours. The cure will work." "It will take time," Elian said, thinking of the long, painful road he himself had traveled. "He will have to choose it. We cannot force it on him." "No," Rhys agreed. "We can't. We can only offer him the choice. That is the difference between us and them." A long silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotions. The memory of the moment before the alarm, the almost kiss in the lab, was a tangible presence in the room. It was a promise that had been interrupted, not broken. Elian walked to the desk and picked up the monomolecular blade he had dropped what felt like a lifetime ago. He held it for a moment, the weapon feeling alien and dead in his hand. He walked to Rhys and held it out to him, hilt first. "I will not need this anymore," he said. Rhys looked at the blade, then back at Elian's face. He did not take it. Instead, he gently closed Elian's fingers around the hilt and pushed his hand down. "No," Rhys said softly. "You may not need it as a weapon of assassination, but you are a protector now, Elian. You protect our people. You protect our future. You protect me." He placed his hand over Elian's on the weapon's hilt, his fingers warm and strong. "And I protect you." The contact was electric. The scent in the room deepened, the warm, earthy fragrance of the alpha weaving with the soft, floral notes of the omega. It was a scent of balance, of harmony, of home. Reese stepped closer, his other hand coming up to cup Elian's jaw, his thumb gently stroking his cheek. His dark eyes searched Elian's, full of a raw, tender emotion he no longer tried to hide. "In the lab," Reese began, his voice a low whisper. "Before the attack, I know," Elian interrupted, his own voice barely audible. "Me too." And that was all that needed to be said. The words were inadequate anyway. The truth was in the air between them, in the touch of their skin, in the steady, rhythmic beat of their hearts that had, at last, found the same tempo. Reese leaned in, and this time there were no alarms, no interruptions. His lips met Elian's. The kiss was not frantic or desperate. It was a slow, deep confirmation of everything that had passed between them. It was the quiet of the lab, the shared purpose of their work, the terror of the battle, and the profound relief of survival, all distilled into a single, perfect moment. It was a kiss that tasted of hope. When they finally broke apart, they rested their foreheads together, breathing the same air. The war was not over. The consortium was still out there, a vast, soulless machine that would not forgive their defiance. The road ahead would be long and dangerous, but for the first time, Elian did not feel like a lone operative facing insurmountable odds. He was part of something larger than himself. He had a home. He had a purpose. He had a name. He looked into the eyes of the man he had been sent to kill, the man who had become his entire world. "My name is Elian," he whispered, the words a vow. Reese smiled, a true, brilliant smile that finally reached his eyes. "I know," he answered. "Welcome home." Outside the viewport, the twin moons of their small, defiant world began to rise, bathing the mountain fortress in a soft, silver light. It was not an ending. It was a beginning, and it was enough.